Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and I'm delivering a lecture today with slides prepared by Mark Gurevich from Canva. I think this is really interesting because it's the introduction to CSS, and CSS is kind of one of the more fun and in some ways simple things you can learn about web development. So, bit of context to start. CSS is what we use to style and add to the presentation of HTML documents. So if you're watching this, you've already learned a little bit about HTML. This page on the left here kind of makes sense to you, but we're going to dig into that just a little bit further now and try and actually style some parts of these web pages. So, first thing is to understand, before we even get into this, what even is CSS? So we've seen previously how we can make a tag, and this is a paragraph, like this. And when we load a web page like this, if I open this up in the browser, I'll open this up in a new tab. This is what the web page is. This is all it renders as. This is a paragraph. Now this is a little bit underwhelming, as you can see, because it's just text. The font's not really that modern, it's kind of bland. And what we can do is when we want to add properties to that, we can use CSS. Now, one of the most straightforward standard ways of adding CSS to a web page is within the head of the web page. You can add a tag, style type equals text CSS, and style. And inside of this, we put information that describes properties of a particular, what we call class. This is not like an object-oriented class, it's just completely unrelated. It's essentially a class of, it's saying a class of objects. Think of it like a template. It's a name we give to say if something has this name, then it's going to have these properties. So what I might do is I'm going to create a CSS class called Hayden's Paragraph. And then inside of that, I'm going to make the font really big. We'll talk about what all this means in a second. This is some very, very straightforward CSS. And most CSS is just this basic principle that we have here, except expanded upon many degrees, and there's a lot of volume to it. So what we've got here is, this is all CSS inside of the style tag. And what it's saying is that if I have an HTML element that has a class name Hayden's Paragraph, then the properties, the visual properties that will have is font size of 20 points. Now what is a point? Don't worry about that at the moment. Just think of it as a kind of arbitrary measurement. Let's put it on the page. So if I take Hayden's Paragraph, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my paragraph tag and I'm going to add a class to it. The class is an HTML attribute, and the value I'm going to give it is the name of the CSS class I've defined. This dot here means class. There's a few alternatives we have to that, but for now all of your CSS classes require a dot out the front before the name. When I give my paragraph this class, it gets really big, and in fact if I change the font size to even bigger, it gets even bigger, and if I change the font size to even bigger, it gets even bigger. And this is how we're using CSS to style these web pages. That's all we're really doing. We're going to be talking a lot about the rules surrounding CSS, and then in other lectures talking about layouts in CSS, as well as some extra stuff on formatting. So let's get into this a little bit. Now, this first slide here essentially says that there are 3 different ways that you can inject CSS into a web page or into an element. The first one on the right here, this is what we've just done here. So this one on the right, we've added styles directly to the document. CSS and styles are pretty much used interchangeably. Given that CSS stands for cascading style sheets, CSS just says that this is a definition of lots of styles. And in this case, the styles that we're defining here for class Hayden's Paragraph are defined in the document. Another way that we could insert this is to put it straight into the HTML element. So just before we do that, let's actually add some more stuff to it. So we want to make this font weight bold too. Now, we'll talk more about these properties and stuff in the formatting lecture. These are just two very basic ones I'll show you. But you can see that when I add this, it makes it bold as well. Now, if I want to, instead of defining all this style up the top, if I want to make that in line, as in just say that this particular element has these particular styles, then usually what I do is I give my p tag a style attribute, and inside of that I put the HTML there directly. And this will have the exact same effect. In fact, if I get rid of this style type equals text CSS, then you'll see that this web page looks exactly the same. This is just another way of doing it. In general, we don't like to do this because it's not reusable, and what I mean by that is if I want to create multiple paragraphs like this, then I have to copy and paste this. That's why we tend not to do it like this. That's why we tend not to do them in line. That's why we tend to put them in like a style sheet like this. Because now you can see that if I have 3 paragraphs and I give them all the same class name, I have had to repeat myself less, and as you know, repeating yourself is one of the general sins of programming. So that's how we do it in line. That's how we do it inside the document. And then the other way to do it is that we can actually take this here, all the CSS, and this is the way we might do it, and I paste it in another document, and I'm going to call that document, this is in our folder here, I'm going to call that styles.css. You can call this file anything you want. Usually it ends in .css, and then I'm going to go back to what I know about HTML, and instead of including it like this, I'm going to say link rel equals style sheet, href equals styles.css. And this is a particular line of HTML that says please go and get styles.css, the file, and include it as a style sheet. And now this page is externally loaded into my web page, and that's where those styles come from. So they're the 3 different types of importing. Most of the time you would do things like this for a real website at scale, because you will have very large style sheets. And if we just load up, say, a very simple, boring website, my unsw.edu.au, and I look at the styles here, you'll see that they probably include some style sheets. You see there's one style sheet here, there's another style sheet here, they've just broken it up like this. That seems to be all they've included inside the head tag. Your link has to be inside the head tag. You can also see here that these are the style sheets. This is some CSS on UNSW's website. This is very big. This is very much likely automatically generated from other like programs that generate CSS, so you wouldn't be writing something like this, but that gives you a sense of how it would be imported. You may also find styles on this page sometimes. Usually if you troll through a web page, you might find some, if we look for a style tag, we don't find any. So this is an example of a website where nothing really has inline styles. If I look at this Canva web page, which it's another page, you might see one link rel, so you can see there's a looking for CSS being included. There's some CSS, so this is some CSS included on Canvas page, except this one is anyway. So anyway, that's how you include it. There's lots of different ways to import it. For ease, we will probably in lectures do a lot of in-document stuff just because it saves us flicking between files. Besides importing, we're going to talk a little bit about structure now. Now, structure has been implied by the examples we just gave, where you can see this little piece up here is made up of a couple of pieces. This class here with some styles in it is made up of a few pieces. The first one is called the selector. The selector is this piece here. That is essentially the scope of it, if you will. You can see here the definition is it's what defines the elements to which the rule applies. It says that, for these styles inside of me, who do I apply them to? And then inside of that, with the braces, we have an unbounded list of properties, and those properties have values. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of CSS properties, and some of them apply to particular HTML tags, some of them apply to others. For instance, there's an audio HTML tag, which applying a font size to probably doesn't do anything. So styles, you can write styles in for pretty much any type. It's just that the browser may choose to ignore them, because it is the browser that takes these styles and actually applies them to the HTML. So in terms of selectors, we've talked about the class selector, which goes through, and any HTML element that has a class property of this name, it applies that style to. There's also the universal selector. This is something that you might use if you want a property to apply, a property's value to apply to essentially every single element. It's not very commonly used. Sometimes we might use it to describe you know, font family, for instance. If we want everything on our website to be font Arial, then we might use this selector, which says every single HTML element. That's usually only really used, in my experience, for font families, maybe a default font size. Often you'll actually see it used, font families. It's not often heavily used, but it does apply to every single HTML element that's rendered. Besides the universal selector, we also have a type selector. Now, what a type selector does is, for a particular HTML tag type, as in the tag name, it will apply a property to. So for instance, if I have a span tag, which we said before is a generic, it's kind of like a blank canvas for text. If I have a span in here that says hello, and I put this on a web page, I can say my selector can be all span tags, and I can give it a property. In this case, I might make it really small, 6 pt. Now you can see that I haven't had to give this span a class name like I have with the paragraph, and that's because that the styles that we've defined here aren't on a particular class name, they're on a particular HTML tag, in this case span. This is very different from .span. This is now a class called span, so if I wanted the span to have it now, I would have to create a class property called span. It's not on the actual tag itself. Using a tag selector is probably most common for inputs is something I see it very often, because on websites or web apps, typically all of your inputs you want to have maybe some same basic properties. Maybe they have some nice edges or a shadow, or they have a certain font size, so they're used very commonly for inputs in my experience. You'll also see them used a lot for H1s and H2s, things like this. So if I have a header and I want that to be, you know, font size 30 pt, I might say something like that. Welcome to my page. Yeah, and that's how you use the type selector, tag name. I call it a tag selector. These slides are being funny. We then have a class selector. This is the one that we talked about just to get it going. It's essentially where it's just a generic name, and we can make that name up. We can call it anything we want. It's a little bit like a style variable, if you will, that you can reuse. As this says, page can contain any number of elements with the same class name. So what this is saying here is that if I call my CSS type class Hayden's paragraph, what I can do is use that as many times as I want. You can see in this case I've already got 3 paragraphs called it. One differing item is the ID selector. Now, an ID selector is a lot like the class selector, except it's used for the ID attribute on HTML and not the class attribute. So for instance, PID in this case, I'll say my paragraph ID equals final paragraph. This is my final paragraph. Right? And when I use the ID specified here, I use a hash instead of a dot. So now this one I'm going to call it final paragraph, and in this case I'm going to make the font size 10 pt, something a little bit smaller. You can see all I've done here is used ID because it's a hash. If I use class, the final paragraph ID selector would not work. Right? This style is not being applied here. Similarly, if I use PID equals Hayden's paragraph, this selector is a class selector, not an ID selector, and therefore this property will not apply either. So that distinction between class and ID really matters. The main difference between a class selector and an ID selector is that an ID selector is used for when you only have one instance of the element. So essentially, this is a bit more to do with HTML. Only one element on a page should have an ID of a particular name. This is important when we learn about the DOM, or the document object model, later. And it's really just a unique key that allows the web browser to know to distinguish a particular element on the web page. So IDs tend to only be used once. Usually you do this if, again, the element you're referring to has an ID because it is uniquely identified. So usually when you're programming with CSS, you'll be using a mixture of class selectors and ID selectors. There's also an attribute selector. This one is a little bit more obscure, but very interesting. And remember how I said before that if you have a series of inputs on your web page, so for instance, if I have an input here, type equals text, maybe I'll have a name input, and then I'll have a password input, like this. I'll use another BR here. What you'll find is that if you want all your inputs to be of a certain font size again, you might say input here, and then you might say font size 15 pt, make it nice and big. If you only want your passwords, for instance, to if you want your passwords to be even bigger, then what you can do is you can say my input of attribute type and value password is going to have a really big font size. So you see now my password ones are even bigger. You could be very creative with this. You could make the background color black, and you could make the text color white. Like this. Now your password field's different. And if you make another password field, that will also be applied. This is often useful if you have tags like input, where inputs are very different based on the type. To be honest, I haven't seen it used much outside of input. It's still very useful, but it's just very common with inputs because input is a very strange HTML tag where if an input is a radio or a checkbox or a text or a submit, they're very different things, and it's a very strange way. You know, I think in reality, I would imagine that you'd normally have a radio tag and a checkbox tag, but that's not how the HTML standard's defined, and that's totally fine. That's not our problem. But that's kind of the situations you might use the attribute selector. And that's essentially like just narrowing the scope of this to say, I don't want this to apply to all inputs. I only want it to apply to inputs where the attribute type is the value password. That's why they call it the attribute selector. We could also do this for other attributes as well if we wanted to. I don't have a good example because I just don't do it that often. Just very common with forms. Okay. I just spilled water on my keyboard. That's a shame. The other things we have are okay. So that pretty much ties off all of the basic rules. In 90% of cases, everything we've done there will pretty much carry you forward in terms of the rules. A reminder that we haven't spent much time talking about specific CSS properties for two reasons. One is that there's a lot of them, and we can do that after we understand the rules. The second one is that CSS properties are very well documented online. So for instance, if you want to say CSS font, you will get, even just on W3 schools, you will have a lot of information here that will tell you, I don't know where it is, CSS font property. You can see here it's like font style, font variant, font weight, font size, line height, font family. There's a lot. You can just read through CSS lists, and the principles aren't that challenging for formatting. They get a bit challenging for layout, which is why we have a separate lecture on layout, but for formatting they're pretty relaxed. Now we're getting into some more advanced stuff. Combinators, pseudo classes, pseudo elements, cascade, inheritance, some specificity, and important, right? Now, what are combinators? I'm going to make this slide a bit bigger because I think it's interesting. Combinators establish a relationship between selectors. So we talked about selectors as, you know, maybe it's this ID or this class or this tag, but you can actually define selectors as multiple. You can put one after another. In this case, we're all using classes. So this HTML here has divs and spans, which are just generic blank canvases. And they have 4 classes, three, A, B, and C. And we're defining these three classes in CSS here, and we're doing them in different ways. If we say .a, then .b before the CSS properties, then what we're saying is that these properties should apply for all classes of type B that live anywhere inside classes of type A. As in anywhere in the tree, if you will, because HTML is like a series of nested, kind of just nested and nested and nested. So if you have a class called A here, this will apply to this B and that B and that B and this B and this B as well. Now, if we maybe very quickly, I might make a copy of this, and we'll just call this one combin for combinators. And I'll just get rid of this body. Now I don't actually have the code that Canva wrote for this, so we're just gonna I'm gonna pause this and then I'll write it out. Okay, welcome back. So what I've got here is I've written this out, and one other thing you'll notice is that I've actually written the 4 styles out, but I've commented the bottom 3 out, and I've commented them through the exact same commenting method that we use with C programming, C++ programming, Java. Just the /*/ block comments. So you can do the same in CSS. HTML comments won't work inside of this either. You can't use this inside of CSS because everything between the 2 style tags is CSS. It's like imagine as a little virtual world where this is not HTML in here in the slightest. So let's actually try and view this page. I made this page called combin.html, and we can reflect on this in a second, but just remember that, quickly run through them. The first one, descendant, all elements of class type B inside elements of class type A will have this property. In the second case, it's saying only class types B which are direct children of class type A will have this property. What that means is in this case, this one will have the property because B is a direct, like class type B of span is a direct child of this div class type A, but this 5 text span will not have the property because even though it's a descendant, it's not an immediate child. So in this first CSS case, this 5 would be read. In the second CSS case, this 5 would not be read. And we could see this contrast here where in this case you can see the 5's read because everything of class type B, which is this line, this line, this line, and this line are read. That makes sense. But once we make it a only a direct child, now 5 is not read because 5 is not a direct child. And if we look at the other ones, what else do we have? We have here, if we use the plus, it's saying that a B that follows immediately after a C, so a B class type that follows immediately after a C class type will have the color red. So that means that this C here will have the color red, but if we make maybe a C above the top here, this one probably won't be red. So we'll just leave this one uncommented, C plus B. And you can see here that, oh, I did this the wrong way around, sorry. I broke that example actually. So you can see here that this B is not immediately followed by a C, therefore its styles are not applied, whereas this B here is immediately followed by a C, so its styles are applied. And then the last case is all sibling B that follows after C. This one's really interesting. So this now, if we comment, let's comment this one. Sorry. What do you think this one will do? So here it's saying all siblings B that follow after C. So we have a C class type here, and now it's saying that all B's after that, all, sorry, I lost the page. Yep, all siblings of B that follow after C. You notice that this div here is not a sibling, is not a B. That's the reason that it doesn't apply to the 5 here, and you can see that the B does not apply to the 6 either. I mean, it hasn't applied to anything because this B is not contained within an A or a C. These rules are very simple in concept. They might be a bit hard to reason with, but this essentially is combinators, and they can be. And you're probably thinking, how does this actually work in a real world? Well, usually what'll happen, sometimes you can do this, is if you have some text like this and you have a p tag, hey, how are you? I'm okay. Sometimes it's easier just to say, for all p's inside of class A, I'd like their color to be blue. And now you don't have to manually go out and write, class equals blue text or something like this. You don't have to do this for all 3 p's because it's specified via the combinator here. So it really helps in making the CSS a bit more elegant, frankly, because it allows you to not have to create all these weird names like paragraph inside of A or something like this, and then paragraph general. That's all it's really for, is it just allows you to structure these better without having to create crazy names. We have a very interesting topic here called pseudo classes. Pseudo classes are essentially where you put a colon after a selector and then you give it its pseudo class. And these are just interesting states that I'm not sure how. Special state, I was going to say, they're quite special, so I'm not sure what word they have. Oops. Special states. We can talk through a couple of these. I'll let you play around with first child and last child yourself, but I think hover, focus, disabled, visited might be a good example. So let's first just have a look at, I might make another page here called pseudo. Let me just copy and paste this. So if you, for instance, have a button, hello, and I'll give that button a class name, call it hi. Now I give it a CSS property, .hi, and inside of that I'll give it a color red. Now color is the CSS element that describes the color of the text, pseudo, and you can see that this button color is now red. We could make it blue, like this. We could make it green. We can do all kinds of things. But when we add further pseudo classes to it, maybe in this case we'll do hi hover, we can now specify what happens in a different special state, in this case when the mouse is over it. You notice that as I bring my mouse over this, it changes to red. There's also hi active, which is used when your mouse is clicked down on it, I believe. Yep. Look at this little party we have going here. And yeah, they're the two main ones. You have like input disabled. You can also do this for a button too. For instance, if we say when the button's disabled, we want the color to be white. This doesn't do anything until you actually disable the button. Then the text is white here. You can see that. Like this style is being applied because this form tag button is now disabled, so that's why that's used there. Probably the other one is as well is just a link. So they say A visited. So A is our anchor, which is a link. So if we want to link to Google, and this text can be Google, when someone loads this link, you'll actually notice this. Browsers have a default state where the link is blue by default, and then it becomes purple once you visited it. That's why if I add a link here to Bambi.com, Bambi Wambi, then it's blue until I click on it, and then because it didn't load, it's not going. I should use a random website. Let's say, I don't know, DonaldTrump.com. Sure, that's a real website. Great. Donald Trump, you notice it's purple now. So what we can say is if that link has been visited, the pseudo class visited, then it will have a color of, say, red. Why not? So if the link's been visited, it's now red. If it hasn't been visited, it's blue. These are pseudo classes. We then have pseudo elements, which are essentially a way of applying properties to things immediately after it. So for instance, if I have a button here called hi, I can say that the HTML element immediately after the button, I would really like to also be green. So you know how our button's green? If I add an element here like next paragraph, oh, that's not good. Let's try it out for something else. Let's try my P. Let's see what this does. Oh no. Sorry, I just had a mind blank and was thinking it was thinking about another pseudo element. But after and first letter are used, I mean in this case you can see that the examples we provided are text. And those text examples are because for double colon after, notice the difference as well between single colon. So pseudo classes just have a single colon, whereas pseudo elements have a double colon. What we're saying is that after, like for a tag that has a class name text, immediately after the content in that tag, we want to add more content, which in this case is star, and that star has the color red. So if we were to add more content here, maybe we want to add a full stop to the end of every sentence. We could add a green full stop to the end of every my P that we want. Like that. So that's what the after is, and you can see first letter as well. That's another pseudo element that will allow you to, maybe make it red, right? I'm keeping the CSS very simple because I don't want to dig too deep into formatting. But you can do all kinds of crazy things with these pseudo elements. Very cool stuff. I don't use them a ton, but I have used them occasionally, and I think they're very helpful when you really need them. Another element about CSS rules are that you can override CSS rules, and this is really getting into, which CSS rule takes precedence. So if I have another hi here, and I make this one color blue, which one takes precedence? Is the button green or is it blue? It's blue because the most recently defined CSS element, if they're of the same precedent, will be the one to define the properties. And then that brings us back to inheritance. Brings us now to inheritance, which is something we haven't really talked about, but when you define a CSS property for an HTML element, by default everything, particularly for formatting, everything inside of that, many properties are inheriting their values from their parents. So this happens a lot for text-based things, colors, formatting. So as you know, I have my my P class for my paragraph. Let's say that I make that, font size 20. Like this. What we're saying is that if I wanted to instead, I could create a span. I could call it paras for paragraphs, and then these elements inside of that, if I was to give my span a font size of 20, you'll notice that I've refreshed, the text is still font size 20 because the span property itself got those the span tag itself got those CSS properties, and the P's inside of it inherited it. This isn't true for every CSS property, but it's very intuitive. The ones you'd expect to inherit will inherit. And you can see this just example here about the same kind of thing. An article has a color. I think this is a dark gray 444. We're going to talk about colors in another lecture. And the span inside of it will also have that color. So, my head's in the way. Sorry, let me get that thing out of the road. Specificity. Specificity. We did it. So one problem is that quite often you'll define styles at many places throughout the code, and a bit like you have to understand precedence and how things override each other. So in the case of CSS, there's essentially four levels, which is that type selectors have the lowest order of precedence, class selectors have the next highest precedence, then ID selectors, then inline styles. So what that looks like in reality is that if we have a div, say, and that div, I'll just put some text inside of that, Hayden, my name, that div will exist on the page, and if I say that all divs are blue, then that will be blue. If I then say that I'd like to give it a class called, hey, and I make it green, then when we apply that class to the div, the green will override it in this case. It won't be the blue, it'll be the green. Because classes override the type selectors, and then IDs will override classes. So if we then say we have an ID called hey, that's color is yellow, if we apply both of these attributes, then it will be yellow. And then on top of all of that, if we add an inline style, which is the thing we did at the start, which has a color of red, this will override everything, and it will be red. So that's the specific. You know what I mean. Read the title, specificity. But an important caveat to that, and this is something that you should use with great caution, as it says here, better to avoid using this as it makes code really hard to debug, is if you're in a pinch and you really need to override a particular property from a different precedent level, then you can use the important, this exclamation mark important. It's a very strange thing, but essentially what it allows you to do is to override that whole tree, and I could just throw important in here like this, and now it'll be blue. So it's kind of, in a way, there's like a fifth one sitting here above all of these, which is important. So it's like important, inline, ID, class, type. And similarly, if you have two things competing for important, then the thing that takes precedent with that is the one that's higher precedent in the hierarchy. So in this case, because IDs are before tag selectors, it'll be yellow if it's important as well. But this important will still beat the inline style red. That's pretty much everything on CSS rules. We haven't really talked much about the properties of CSS or how to use them, but this is the rules of engagement of how you define selectors and how they're interpreted by the browser, in what order, and other things you can do with them.